We're in Queensland. And it's just gone 11 o'clock, so it's absolutely wonderful. Again, I'd love to introduce myself, Melissa Langton, and Adrian Vaida from Romania, but now an Australian citizen. Really wonderful to have you here, and we're so excited to be able to present some of this information. Now, we got an overwhelming response, and it's so exciting to have you all here to listen to us. And also for those of you who will be listening to the recording, it's wonderful to be able to share this information. Before we start, what I wanted to do was introduce myself, because I won't be doing much of the talking, which for those of you who know me, you will know that is very unusual. So I'm Melissa Langton, owner and director of Exceler8's. I like to think of myself as a people paracetamol, but I build confidence in business owners and people leaders so that they're making the right decision when it comes to their people. And no surprises or limited surprises. That's really my motto. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring Adrian before you to be able to ask some questions, and you've said, thank you very much for the questions that you have sent me around areas of ESG and what it actually looks like, because believe me, it's not the top end of town that need to think about this. So that's why I wanted to bring Adrian in front of you today. So I wanted to introduce officially Adrian. So I mentioned before from Romania originally, so welcome. Really impressive career of over 22 years. And I needed to take notes on this because it was overwhelming in terms of the passion that he shows in this subject. He's got a plethora of academia studies and qualifications, so I need to read them out because there's a PhD, an MBA, business sustainability programs in Cambridge, Oxford, Yale, and MIT. But that's not the driving reason as to why he does what he does. When I spoke to Adrian, it was an awesome quote. He says he's really passionate about supporting our small to medium businesses to do well while doing good. And that is exactly the space that I love to work in, hence the reason I put him in front of you. So it's really about taking businesses and helping them grow using this ESG framework. But I know that when I talk to people around ESG, they really don't know what that is. And I'm always remiss of not explaining what ESG is, because it's another acronym. It can be almost like buzzword bingo. So in its simplest form, Adrian, what is a ESG?
ESG is a performance measurement framework, and it measures business performance other than financial. And now that I've said that, if you think about financial business performance, we've got pretty good at measuring that. And it has been perfected over the last 150 years since we've started running the capitalist model, right? To the point where we are today. But starting with late last century and early 2000s, there has been a need that emerged, and that was to measure performance, business performance, other than financial.
Right.
In other words, business sustainability performance. It's driven mainly by the financial industry, the investment branch of the finance industry, and it was triggered by a very simple question. What's a sustainable business? How do we know? And how do we measure that? And so the answer to this question was a framework split or grouped on three pillars: environment, social, and governance, which is what ESG stands for. And each of them having a subset of metrics, individual metrics underneath, and together, comprehensively, this is being used to measure and benchmark business sustainability performance for investment purposes.
So it's not just, I have an accounting firm and I have a recycling program. That's not what ESG is, or am I being compliant when it comes to ESG with my recycling program?
There's a number of aspects in there. So for one, recycling will and is actually part of ESG, because recycling is an aspect of material use. And essentially it's about minimizing waste and redirecting streams of materials back into production. That's what recycle means. You divert it from the landfill back into reuse.
Right.
And so you look at that's technically an environment aspect, and it sits neatly under E in the waste management space. So that's where recycling fits in ESG. Now, of course, having or not having a recycling management system in place in any business might increase or decrease your ESG rating accordingly. It won't wreck it, but it will impact it positively if you have it and negatively if you don't.
Mm.
However, when you mention compliance, that is a very different conversation because ESG is not about compliance. Compliance implies that there's some sort of legal requirement or some sort of standard that is in place that essentially compels the business to comply with. Now, ESG is not such a thing. ESG, as I said, is used by the financial industry to assess and determine sustainability business performance. But as in so far, there is no compliance element associated to it. If you look at the component elements, yes, there will be a lot of laws that fit neatly in one of the metrics or the other under the ESG. But overall, there is no one law that requires ESG compliance. So compliance is not on the table in ESG terms.
So it's not just a focus around just ticking a whole heap of boxes.
If you want to get a good rating,
Oh,
then
right.
yes, you
Okay.
are focusing on ticking all of those boxes.
Yeah.
But if getting a good rating for investors is not on your agenda, then you can really overlook it altogether. It's irrelevant for your business. Mind you, having said that, irrelevance is no longer a valid statement in today's day and age and world, but it would still, from the business perspective, you can ignore it if you want. At your peril, but you can.
So why do you say at your peril as a business owner, or I might be sitting here in a manufacturing plant with a couple of sites, I've got maybe 50 staff, my turnover might be 50 million.
Yeah.
Why should I care about ESG?
Okay, so this is a compound answer. One of the elements is the fact that we run business on risk and opportunity. And we don't run business on personal opinions and beliefs. And so in order to manage a business, you have to have a strategy that is essentially determined and based upon the risks and opportunity this particular business is facing. Now, these risks and opportunities are determined by what's happening in the wider world, which is where the PESTEL framework came into management theory, political environment, social, technological, legal, and so on. These are all components of the external environment of the company, and they come with associated risks and opportunities. And so when you establish the strategy for a business, you have to assess this environment.
Yeah.
And what's happening in there will determine what you do or don't, alongside your risk appetite as the business decision factor and decision maker. A long way around to saying that there's a lot happening in the world in terms of ESG. There's a suite of environmentally related crises, such as the global warming, the biodiversity loss, the quality of and access to water, and so on and so forth. So these are what they call mega trends, and they're all grouped in one single mega trend, that is the sustainability issue that the world is facing. And when you look at that, from that perspective, this will inform business behavior in terms of risk and opportunity, because for an individual business in this context, there will be a suite of risks that it is exposing itself to, and a suite of opportunities that it could benefit from if it acted upon.
Right.
And so that's pretty much the whole philosophy. You look at what's happening in the wider environment, and then you decide what's relevant for your business and whether you want to act on it or not, and then you go and do just that.
So why should I care? What are those opportunities you talk about when you say there's the risks and the opportunities, but what is an opportunity that you can see when we understand this ESG framework you're talking about?
For one, there's this environmental theory, right? We are all stewards of our planet, and we're all responsible for maintaining and preserving it in its current state as much as we can. But this is now an ethical point of view, because it is about doing good. However, business itself is not predicated as much on an ethical perspective as it is predicated on a financial performance perspective. So essentially, we live the Milton Friedman's paradigm or doctrine, that's the way it's been termed. And in a nutshell, what Milton Friedman got a Nobel Prize in economics for is stating that business exists to make money. He didn't say it like this, but this is the simplified version. So if business exists to make money, then business will do everything in its power to maximize its profitability, with one caveat: as long as it is legal. Now, not everything that is legal is also ethical.
Don't we know it?
Right? So this is where the gray area comes in, because we all know that tobacco is killing people. It's a fundamentally true statement. However, tobacco is legal. Is it ethical to kill people? It depends how you look at it. But as long as we're making money and it is legal, we're doing it. And so when you circle all the way back to where the opportunity is in essentially improving the way we make a business profitable, bringing that ethical view and embedding it into the business. And it may mean leaving some business areas altogether, like exiting them altogether. And speaking of this, there is one sustainability investment behavior, which is values driven as opposed to value driven. Normal investment is focused on maximizing the return, which is essentially value driven. But when you bring in the values dimension, then you start excluding a certain type of industries and certain businesses from your portfolio.
Right.
For example, tobacco might be one of them. I don't want to finance that type of industry, so I will specify to my super fund, you shouldn't be investing in this type of industries.
Right. So it could be a direction of where investment might go, or it could be a direction of if they start using these values-based versus value.
Yes.
Yeah. And then as small to medium businesses, then how do we, because we're not super funds, how do we, where are we in that value chain, essentially?
Now you said the word, right? The value chain is the answer.
Yeah.
So what's happening is the entire trend towards sustainability has been around for maybe 50 years now. It started with environmentalism, and then it evolved through corporate social responsibility and people, planet, profit, and all sorts of theories and frameworks to what it is today. ESG is the last such item in this long journey.
Right.
But when you look at what has been and where it's going, the change has mainly been driven by the finance industry.
Right.
So you're going back to money. As long as the money was not part of the conversation, the progress, as much as has been there, hasn't been fast enough and impactful enough. So towards the end of the last decade, the world realized that if we continue like this, we will not meet the challenges that we are facing. So we need to change something, which is when the finance industry stepped in, because businesses are about profit. So as long as you're talking about money, that will be the driving force. So the better question was, how do we take this and we incorporate it in the financial conversation that businesses need to have? And that was essentially the reason for moving towards embedding ethical concerns into business as usual, / embedding sustainability into business as usual.
Okay. So sustainability isn't the only thing. So there's the E, the S, and the G.
Yes.
So if we think of the E, which is environmental, so are there any special or certain certifications that small businesses should be considering to allow to open them up for opportunities into the future that you can see at this point in time?
There's a myriad of specific certifications. Now, I need to make a parenthesis here.
Yeah.
Sustainability certification, be it environmental or any other sort, is essentially an expensive signal. No business is compelled, obliged, or forced in any way to get a certification of any sort. So if they go through the trouble of getting it, they incur a cost, because that's an exercise, like anything that business does, is a cost. So by default, when you get a certification, you're incurring a cost. Now you do that to signal something to the market. And that is essentially, look how committed I am to this, that I'm willing to spend money I don't have to spend just to show it. Now, when we go back to the specifics of certain certifications, you can think of the most common ones, like the Energy Star rating on your fridge, on your washing machine. That's a certification. The Health Star of any food package. You buy a bag of chips and it got that little star for health, star rating with healthiness of the food that you're eating. That's a certification. These are just two examples, but there's a lot of them. And they are very business specific because obviously it will make no sense for any engine manufacturing business to get a food rating system. So it's business specific, and it is a business decision whether you want to undertake it or not. And so therefore, I don't really have a very pointy answer. Depending on which business you're in, you should scan for available certifications and then make a decision whether they are meaningful and whether you want to incur that cost or not.
Yeah. And that meaningful piece is probably the crux here, is whether it's going to actually mean something for the business to get it. It's not just a tick and flick. Is that
correct? Yeah. We're going back to the same treatment of business exists to make money. So essentially, the better question would be, will this help us make more money? And that's pretty much one of the ways many businesses approach this decision. Do we really want to get certified with whatever Green Star rankings or Energy Star or whatever it is? Do we want to go there or not? Will it help us make more money?
And then the other part, I hear a lot about carbon and carbon footprint and carbon accounting and just carbon. And for me, it's just stop using your car as much, which I'm sure it's not. It's definitely not that simple. So what is a business measure, or why are we talking about this carbon accounting, and or is it just some way, that whole greenwashing approach?
Let's park the greenwashing for now.
Of course.
So there's a high level answer and then there's a low level answer. The reason we're talking about carbon at the global level is very simple. Of all the sustainability challenges that the world is facing right now, the number one is carbon. And that is essentially the thing that fuels global warming. It's not just as simple as carbon. There's 7 climate change gases, and they come together into a term called carbon equivalent. But bottom line, we're talking carbon one way or another. Okay, so we are all focused on carbon because we're trying to prevent this global warming from getting out of hand. That's the simple answer. Okay, now when you go to the more detailed answer, how can my business impact all of that? Because I'm just a small business. I don't have an impact at the global level. Now you're talking about essentially change making and critical mass, and the fact that everyone has an impact on the carbon emissions globally speaking. Because we're alive and we activate in the world, our own emissions contribute. Therefore, it linearly and from the common sense point of view, if I reduce my emissions and you reduce yours and everyone does the same, eventually we'll end up putting less carbon emissions in the atmosphere, and hopefully we'll make a difference. That is the bottom line answer. Where does the financial aspect come in? You go back to the same statement that business exists to make money. And whatever business does, it's a cost. So we are now asking, we're talking about electrification of the economy on the premise that the electricity that will be generated is carbon-free, as in not produced in coal-fired power plants or gas-fired ones. So essentially, it's a two-element conversation. Get green energy and electrify the economy, and then you've got rid of the fossil fuel conversation, which is one of the main carbon contributors. It's not as simple as it sounds because of the financial conversation. All of these plants and operations and businesses that we have running at this point in time, in a given moment in time, whereby they've made investments, they are not fully depreciated, they haven't gotten the value out of those investments, and those investments are dependent on traditional fuels like coal and gas and so on. So therefore, you are ending up with a cost conversation. And that's where the financial aspect comes in. You want them to change, but they're not incentivized to change because of the financial implications of change.
Wow.
So it's complex. That's the short answer. There's a global level, an individual level, and then there's the financial in between.
Now I want to move on to my favorite part, which is the social part. Obviously, I'm really passionate about this. So what does that look like when we talk about the S and ESG.
Okay.
What do they look like for businesses?
Yeah. So again, you go back to the ESG, right? The three verticals: environment, social, governance.
Yeah.
The social vertical, as the name suggests, is all about people. And when you put the business lens on this and you look at people through a business lens, you've got several groups. You've the stakeholders, and they're all people, even if there are other businesses are groups of people. So eventually you end up with people again. And then you've got communities, and then you've got supply chains, and then you've got employees, and then you've got whatever you're delivering, be it a product or a service, to people, which then implies a responsibility and a quality guarantee. And when you get back to the employees, and I will come back to you on this one, one of the main issues there is the health and safety of employees, right? So particularly if you're in a manufacturing organization that makes things, as few people as possible should be one of your main goals. But then you go back, these very employees in contractual engagements with the company, and then all of the implicit aspects come in, like fair pay, equal opportunity, gender equality, all of these things, employee reward and remuneration systems, all of these come in under the social pillar. And because this is your area of expertise, I think you're better placed to talk about this employee subsegment of the social sphere.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. The ESG feels as if it's this whole new science, but really when we're looking at it, all we've done is just like we put it into those vertical columns, and especially the social part, we already do some of these aspects. It just looks like really good HR practices when I look at what you're talking about, which is the fair pay, the remuneration. Also, a lot of the legislation has driven behind some of this, being the psychosocial compliance. Work health and safety has been around for a long time, so it's probably not a foreign concept. I just think it might be more, we're going to get more of a drive that there's going to be investors and supply chain requirements to show evidence of how we measure it and manage it. Is that what you're finding?
Short answer, yes. And I'll actually compound it by adding one of the latest developments, not only in Australia, but specifically in Australia, the Modern Slavery Act update from last year, which is covering the supply chain aspect of business, and is essentially trying to eliminate slavery from the supply chain. But that is one small element of this legal piece. But you're essentially correct. It's nothing new. It has been around for a long time, and it is just a new way of looking what has been around for a long time. There's some novelty elements like this one that I just mentioned, but essentially not that much. It's all about bringing it together and looking at it with a different end in mind and from a different perspective. The ESG one.
If we have a look at, say, for example, the E, the S, and the G, the governance part, it feels sometimes that the governance piece is something we already do. What's the difference with the governance in this form versus what we've always done from a governance perspective?
There's several aspects here. So for one, yes, governance is what we do. It is essentially the collection of processes and the overall big process that we employ to run a business. That's what governance is. So therefore, if we're running a business, by default, we do governance. That doesn't mean we're doing it well.
Right.
And this is where the catch is, because when you look at the G vertical in ESG, they look at things like board composition, executive remuneration, management system, risk management falls under this as well. And it essentially, particularly in the SME space, it comes down to the fact, to the reality, have you got a governance system in place? How good is it? How complete is it? Are you actually covering all of the aspects that you need to cover? And more often than not, the answer is not really. We do have what's required, and it's mostly focused on legal compliance, but not much more than that. So when you want to improve your ESG score, for example, by definition, you will need to improve your governance, particularly in the SME space. It's not as common in the larger enterprises, but no one's perfect.
So what really, when we look at that, I guess, and you've said it a few times, Adrian, is really around the financial part of all of this, because The reality is we generally don't care unless it's going to cost us money or it's a huge risk to the business. So what is that financial governance perspective look like? So what's changing here and how do you improve that bottom line for businesses when we're looking at ESG?
Okay, so there's in terms of ESG and financial performance, because remember the way I put it in the beginning, ESG is about measuring the business performance other than financial. So essentially, we're now talking about measuring, you can call it ethical performance, but it's actually sustainability performance. So when you intersect that with the financial performance, it becomes a question of how can we leverage this sustainability aspect to generate business value.
Yeah.
And it becomes it's essentially split in four main categories. It's about cost reduction, particularly on the short term. Is there something in the ESG spectrum that would enable my business to reduce costs? And one very straightforward example is green energy. Can I source or generate my own electricity? And can I generate my green electricity and therefore paying no bills for power and generating carbon-free energy at the same time? So that would be a straightforward example for cost reduction. Revenue increase is the other one. Obviously, if you reduce costs and you maintain your sales, overall you would be increasing revenue. But there's more to it. Can I increase revenue by advertising that what I'm doing is essentially sustainable in opposition with what the competition is doing? So therefore increasing your market share by using the ESG component of what your business is actually doing. So that's two of them. The third one is risk reduction. And risk is generally associated with two things. It's with legal compliance. Are we compliant with incoming laws? Modern slavery is one. Climate-related financial risk reporting is another one, and that's incoming, particularly in Australia. And the other one is, what's the competition doing? Because if they move forward in this space and we are not, that's a risk. We are at risk of looking back as we're the laggards in the space. So it's risk management one-on-one there. That's the third element. And the last one is intangible value. And it goes back to people and perceptions and this sort of thing, whereby you can, for example, become an employer of choice, a very attractive company to work for, if you're scoring high on sustainability performance, because you'll be doing all good things, protect the environment, minimize waste, do the good things by the people, by all stakeholders, have solid governance processes in place, have fair remuneration processes, all of those things you would be doing. So therefore you'd be attractive to anyone interested to look at your business from that perspective. So that's intangible value creation. It goes beyond just being employer of choice and an ethical business, but it's part of.
So it's really actually giving us the intangible once upon a time, because believe me, I could talk till the cows come home around employer of choice and what you could do that, but it's always intangible value. This is almost giving a value that is tangible when we're trying to grow and when we're trying to contribute to a supply chain. If we can start to tick some of these elements, we will actually be more attractive, or we might be the only people that someone could look at.
That's that's opportunity one-on-one.
But the converse is then risk, right? Because then you can't be looked at. Wow. So I've got some questions. So thanks very much from those playing at home. How much should I consider in my budget to start my ESG exploration?
I will focus on the word start, which essentially means not much has been done before. So if we look at it from this premise, it is not a massive cost, because the very first step would be about understanding the gap. You would look at your business from trying to understand where are we right now, what have we got and what are we missing. And that's the first step, essentially, understanding the gap. Once you do know what you have in place and what you're missing, the next step is, what I have good enough? And if not, how can I improve it? And what am I missing and what do I need to do to put it in place? This is usually where the higher cost comes in, because it depends what you're missing at the end of the day. Putting in perfecting your governance system would be straightforward and relatively easy and cheap, because it means you don't have a set of policies and procedures. How hard is it to put that in place? But if what you're missing is an employee remuneration system, then that would be a different conversation, because this would require a longer time frame and a very detailed look at what you would be doing. Why are you doing this and not that? Why are you doing it like this and not like that? And so that's where the bigger cost comes in. To start, it's not a big cost. It's all about understanding the gap.
I guess the question for me then is, what are we benchmarking ourselves against? So we have a gap, but how do we know what that gap is? Are we benchmarking ourselves against your BHPs or your KPMGs, or are we benchmarking against a set of standards that we know are going to be coming in?
I would say it would be a wrong approach to benchmark against a business. Now, this is with a caveat though, because particularly if you find yourself in the supply chain of that business, you might be subject to requirement of the said business that come down the supply chain. Therefore, whether they're good or not, it is not that relevant. If you have to do it in order to maintain your position in the supply chain, then you would do it.
Right.
And so the good, bad doesn't have a place in that conversation. It doesn't mean they are perfect. It doesn't mean they're doing the right thing, but you have to do it because they ask you to. It's a qualifier in business terms. So that's one. Now, in terms of benchmarking, there's quite a few frameworks available and standards already in place. For example, there's the ESRS standards. That's a suite of 77 standards that mainly businesses in America use.
Yeah.
There's 77 of them because they're industry specific. So what I'm saying is you can find which industry your business is positioned in, and you look at that suite of standards, and that will give you a set of parameters. And that's when you start talking about good, bad, because the standard is essentially a best practice type of thing. This is, if you were to be the best, this is how it looks like. And then you can ask, how far am I from that? And now you've got a quantitative metric that you can track and measure progress with.
So we've got what suits us or what we would like to aspire to. And then also, if we're going to be part of a supply chain, we need to look at what we need to qualify to be part of that supply chain. And I think that's where the opportunities are, right?
Yes. And the risk. Because if you don't have it, you might lose that particular business. So that is a very powerful and real value risk. Losing business is essentially losing revenue. So now you're talking real business risk.
Absolutely.
Because of ESG.
Yeah. So I do have, there's been one more come in, and it's something, and you just mentioned it before. Why is everyone talking about this climate related financial risk?
So we go back to the fact that the global warming is the main sustainability challenge we're facing. And we are trying to employ the financial leverage and use the financial industry as a stimulant to speed up progress. This is, and the way that has been implemented in practice is via a suite of standards, the global standards, the IFRS, International Financial Reporting Standards Organization. They've created climate financial risk disclosure standards. That's the second one. And they have two standards, and both these standards are being taken on board by governments across the world and implemented and turned into mandatory pieces, right? So they become a compliance conversation. And the compliance conversation is focused on organizations disclosing their climate-related financial risk. There's a better question, what's that? And so we won't go in there, but it is coming. And that's why everyone's talking about it, because now it's a compliance piece. It's a qualifier for doing business. If you're not disclosing, and you should, then you're breaking the law.
So that's coming. So we've got to make sure we're reporting on it. But if we don't qualify to report, why would we care?
For two main reasons. The law, and I'm now getting into details, so in particular for Australia, and not only, but the law that's coming in for Australia requires disclosure of Scope 3 emissions. And Scope 3 emissions are the emissions along the supply chain. So if an organization falls within the scope of the law, everyone who is part of their supply chain essentially needs to feed up the chain their carbon emissions so that they can be totalized and disclosed by this organization. So whether you're in scope or not, if they are, you are. That's one. And the other one is there's a special clause in the standard for financial institutions who need to disclose financed emissions. So now if you're dealing with a financial institution, either they are investing in your shares or it's a bank that you get money from as a loan, you might need to disclose your carbon emissions as part of getting that loan.
Wow.
So this, and whether you're in scope of the law or not, doesn't really matter in this context, because they are, and they require it from you to be compliant. So there's a whole of economy exposure to this that many people do not see. Now, whether it will land like this or not, it's still open, but this is how the outlook is at this point in time.
Wow, Adrian, you've really definitely given me a lot to think about. And I think the key thing, because I'm conscious we've got a couple more minutes, but what's your piece of advice for a business sitting there thinking, I don't know how this affects me. I don't even know if it affects me at all. What do I do? Where do I start? And how do I get support in doing this?
Again, it's the same for when starting.
Yeah.
Understand where your gap is, understand where you are, understand what you have and what you don't. And very importantly, one that I didn't mention before, have a conversation up and down your supply chain and understand the requirements that come or may be coming your way because of this.
So is it a matter of asking, what are you doing in the ESG space, or what's your requirement to comply? What would be the question I would ask my supply chain?
It would be more specific than that, particularly with the carbon piece. In terms of carbon, the question would be, what is your expectation for data availability from us? And in many cases, they wouldn't know themselves just yet, but it's a matter of time until they know. And when that becomes clear, it will very likely translate into a procurement conversation, whereby they'll come back to you and say, if to remain part of our supply chain, this is one add-on, this is an add-on to our supply contract. And if you cannot comply, we are sorry. So getting ahead of that.
Yes. We have another question.
Please.
What is the main argument or reason that gets real ESG buy-in from the C-suite? For example, is it when something goes wrong, or is it when the value of ESG is being recognized as a true sustainability tool?
In principle, the C-suite is incentivized to maximize the financial performance of the organization. So to get their attention, you have to talk ESG with a financial performance flavor, be that in opportunity or risk. And when we say opportunity, it's one of the two: costs or cost reduction, revenue increase. And when you talk about risk, is legal compliance and or business risk. Right? And of course, there's the intangible value, but that is harder to quantify financially. That is a sweetener usually, but it won't get their full attention. However, when we talk strong dollars and or strong risk, they listen. That's the way to go. And I guess you've already given us a few of those metrics to look at it, but you need to be educated in your market. So supply chain and procurement risks, opportunity risks, well, not opportunity risk, but opportunities within your market and supply chain. But it all has to be through data, doesn't it? Yes.
Yeah. Excellent. I'm conscious at the time, and it's really fantastic to be able to have a chat with you, Adrian. How can people work with you?
As you well know, Melissa, I have a business advisory company called the Sustainability Compass. Obviously, it has a website, sustainabilitycompass.com.au. So going there, so reaching out to me in any way, I can obviously, I'm here to help. That's what I set up the business for. And the name suggests.
Absolutely. The guide. I guess the other element, I know that you and I have spoken about this. There's numerous grants available within governments for you to be able to get support with that. But as I think we've identified today, whole ESG spectrum is basically doing business well and doing good. So I think it's probably really important that people do their research to be able to look at what is going to be impactful for your business, because again, it is a cost, but there is absolute tangible value, but also risks when it comes to this. So I want to say a huge thank you, Adrian, again, for your time today.
My pleasure.
And for those of you both watching the recording and also live, thank you so much for joining us. You will be getting a little bit of a gift. I'll be sending, and you can request a link to a ESG health check, which Adrian has kindly gifted us. that'll actually give you that starting point to help understand what is required. I've done it myself and I have a lot of work to do. So I'm looking forward to working with Adrian on that. Additionally, please send through any of the questions through to me. I'm very happy to be able to talk to Adrian about those questions and see if I can get them answered for you. But a genuine thank you to all of you. And just know when it comes to this ESG, we aren't starting from scratch. And I think Adrian's really highlighted that this is just about doing better. We've seen lots of governance introduced into businesses. You might think of ISO, you might think of work health and safety, fair work, and accounting practices and tax changes. This is just another element of that, and lean on that network that we have all been so grateful and we've nurtured. And that's really going to be where we start to have these types of conversations and moving forward. So I wish you a very happy day from wherever you are listening, and good luck in that ESG journey. And we can't wait to be able to see you once again in our next event. Thanks very much. Thanks, Adrian.
Thank you. Thank you once again.